Good afternoon and welcome to Live from the Archives. Today we're going to look at the life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and in particular look at the heroes that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had. Archives help us reconstruct who those heroes were and help remind us of the qualities that we admire them for in the first place. So in 2004, we celebrated the 350th anniversary of American Jewish life in the United States. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave a speech at the historic Newport Synagogue. There, she talked about the Jewish justices that preceded her, including Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, Abe Fortas, Benjamin Nathan Cardozo, and Arthur Goldberg. She later sent that speech to the American Jewish Historical Society for safekeeping with an autograph letter. That has been digitized so that you can access it directly. Also in 2004, she gave a speech for the Jewish Women's Archive in which she spoke about her childhood heroes, the people who inspired her when she was growing up. And that included Emma Lazarus and Henrietta Szold, whose collections are here at AJHS. That speech is no longer extant. However, she gave a similar speech talking about those heroes about a year ago at a celebration for Moment Magazine. So we're going to go to that. Thank you to Moment Magazine for letting us play this clip. I know they're also working on a book on this topic, but we'll hear Ruth Bader Ginsburg talk about Emma and Henrietta Szold.
I am sometimes asked, who were your role models? The term role model was not yet in vogue in my childhood, but thinking back, I recall two Jewish women, both raised in the USA, whose humanity and bravery inspired me in my growing up years. First, Emma Lazarus, elder cousin to the great jurist Benjamin Nathan Cardozo. Emma Lazarus was a Zionist before that word came into vogue. Her love for humankind, and especially for her people, is evident in all her writings. She wrote constantly from her first volume of poetry, published in 1866 at age 17, until her death from cancer far too soon at age 38. Her poem, The New Colossus, etched on the base of the Statue of Liberty, has welcomed legions of immigrants, including my father and grandparents, people seeking in the USA shelter from fear and long for freedom from intolerance. My next inspirer, Hadassah founder Henrietta Szold. Born in 1860, 11 years after Emma Lazarus, Szold lived until 1945. My mother spoke of her glowingly. Szold too was a Zionist even before Theodore Herzl came on the scene. Among her many undertakings, she started night schools to teach English and trades to waves of Jewish immigrants coming from Russia and other Eastern European countries. That was in the last decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century. My father, born near Odessa, arrived in New York in 1909 at age 13. He was the beneficiary of a night school of the kind sparked by Henrietta Szold.
So as you know, we have the book where Emma Lazarus wrote her poetry, and we also have the collection of Henrietta Szold, and we're going to take a look at that later today. But I also want to mention another collection. We have an unexpected collection that you wouldn't expect to find material about Ruth Bader Ginsburg in this collection, but it's a collection of Russ and Daughters, the appetizing store on the Lower East Side. And the story that Ruth Bader Ginsburg would tell is that she thought of feminism, before she knew the word feminism, she kind of learned about it by going to Russ and Daughters. She told Julie Cohn, the documentary filmmaker who made Sturgeon Queens and later RBG, the documentary, She told her that it gave her such happiness to see that there was an enterprise in which the daughters counted as much as the son, because this was a point where all the signs said and sons and sons and sons, and here was and daughters. And that made a difference to the young Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We're going to go now to look at the collection of Hadassah. We're going to go to Melanie Myers, our Director of Collections, and she's going to show us some of the artifacts that help us bring the story of Henrietta Szold back to life. And Hadassah, of course, was a place where there were many heroes. And so one of the exciting things about Henrietta Szold is how she created a space for other women to become heroes as well.
Hi, I'm Melanie Myers, Director of Collections and Engagement here at the American Jewish Historical Society. One aspect of the AJHS collections that many people in the audience may not be familiar with is how incredibly well represented women are in the archives here at the American Jewish Historical Society. They are represented through the personal papers of people like the wonderful poet Emma Lazarus and the entertainer Molly Pekin, but they are also incredibly well represented in the organizational papers that we have here at the AJHS, ranging from organizations such as the National Council for Jewish Women, as well as more recent acquisitions like the papers of the UJA Federation, where women served in leadership capacities and as amazing fundraisers throughout much of its long and storied history. But today we're going to discuss a collection that is very near and dear to my heart, which is the Hadassah Collection. And the Hadassah Collection also really forms a pivotal piece of this documentation of the history of Jewish women in America, their accomplishments, their opportunities for leadership, and how this played out on a much larger scale in terms of American Jewish life. So we're going to start by looking at some of the boxes here. So we are currently in the artifact aisle of the Hadassah Collection, and this is very unusual. AJHS does not have many collections that are so rich in artifacts, and by artifacts what I mean are objects, things that are not books, that are not paper, but are 3D objects collected by these organizations that help to tell the story of what these organizations were doing. And Hadassah has an enormous artifact collection because Hadassah has there's a very unusual facet of the Hadassah archives, which is that Hadassah seemed to know very early on, and my guess is that this was largely driven by their founder, Henrietta Szold. She seemed very aware, and the organization seemed aware right from the beginning, that they were going to occupy a very important place in American Jewish history, and they saved everything. In fact, Hadassah for years employed their own archivist to maintain their archives on site before they were transferred here to the AJHS to provide greater access for researchers. So let's look at some of the things that are found here in the Hadassah artifact collection. So when we house artifacts, the thing you have to realize is this. For archives and documents, the boxes are a pretty standard shape. You have a banker's box or a manuscript box. But for artifacts, you need to make a bespoke box because the box needs to fit the object. It needs to be specific to the object so that it can preserve and maintain the object, which can be in many different types of formats for as long as we possibly can. So right here, this is actually one of the largest archival boxes. It might be the largest archival box that we have here at the American Jewish Historical Society. This is clearly an extremely large box. So what would we put in something like this? What would go in something like this? And the answer is something like this. This is the cape from a Hadassah nurse's uniform, the uniform that was worn by Hadassah nurses during a great many of their public health initiatives all over the globe. And so this beautiful cape, and you can see with the red lining, it just looks fantastic even after all these years, and that is largely because of this type of preservation that needs to take place to maintain the integrity of the object. But also within this big box, we also have a smaller box, which looks a little different. You can see it's got a hinge here, and it's got a lot of tissue paper inside. And what goes in that box is this, which is the Hadassah nurse's cap, which was also an integral part of the Hadassah nurse's uniform at that point in time. So you can see we have big box and we have medium box, and then we have some smaller boxes. We have ones that are even smaller than this, ones that are the size of jewelry boxes, in fact. And so these boxes hold some of the smaller items in the Hadassah collection. And one of the most fun things that I love the best about this collection is the fact that they saved an enormous amount of the things they gave away to their membership at the conventions. So this is from the convention. This is from the 1960s. We're not sure entirely what year it was, but these are coasters in the shape of a vinyl LP, everybody, and they're embossed with Hadassah record-making organization. I just love that. I think that is absolutely adorable. But also, just so you can see, you know, how invested they were in all of this amazing swag and gifts they gave to the members, the coasters also came with the little slip cover that normally would accompany a vinyl 78 or even a 45. So this is the kind of objects that the Hadassah collection is very rich in, but it's also rich in documents, and it's also rich in printed materials. The Hadassah collection is the third largest collection housed here at the AJHS. The first largest is UJA Federation, which is over 2,000 linear feet. The second is National Jewish Welfare Board, which was discussed extensively during our program on GI Jews. That clocks in at somewhere around 1,800 linear feet. And then we have Hadassah, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,300 linear feet, making it the third largest collection. But Hadassah has another distinction here, which is Hadassah is consistently in the top 5 most heavily used collections here at the AJHS, and has frequently been the #1 most heavily used collection. And people, well, why? Are there so many people that are writing histories of Hadassah? Are there so many people that are writing about their founder, Henrietta Szold, an incredibly important and influential woman in her own right? And the answer is yes. People, of course, are very interested in Hadassah and Henrietta Szold. But the amazing thing about the Hadassah archives is that it is of interest to an enormous base of researchers because of the breadth of what is covered here. It's over 100 years, so it covers 2 centuries. It also covers a geographically large area. Think about the Hadassah chapters. In every state in the United States, multiple chapters in certain states, but also in Canada and international chapters, all of that is covered. But also think about all the Hadassah philanthropic work, which happened also globally across multiple continents and across multiple areas of interest. Public health researchers are very interested in Hadassah. Why? Because of the Hadassah Medical Organization, because of the public health nurses that were deployed, because of the hospital building in Israel, because of an enormous amount of projects that Hadassah spearheaded and funded over their long and storied history. And this history of women, of Jewish women, of public health, of leadership, of philanthropy, crosses over so many different interdisciplinary research topics and makes this collection a real draw for all types of researchers. And so I'm quickly going to show a few more things here to show some of the great paper items that we also have in the collection, the kind of things that people would use. This is sheet music that was written at Hadassah Daughters of Zion for when they would sing these songs at the conventions. We have an entire box full of different specific Hadassah sheet music. Also, We Are the Ladies of Hadassah is another very popular one, evidently, that was sung at these conventions. And so these are the types of things that are held here. Those particular sheets of music are extremely fragile. Also, I don't know if you can tell, but they're housed in plastic to keep them as well preserved as we can. We also have, Hadassah saved their minutes from board sessions, executive committee sessions, and had them all bound for the ease of researchers, and we have them back to the first Hadassah board meetings that were in the 1920s. And last, this is one of my favorite things that was added to the archive later. Henrietta Szold sadly died in 1945, but the organization that she founded and the work of Hadassah still continues to this day, an extremely active and involved membership all across the United States. But here in Israel in 1976 produced paper money with Henrietta Szold right there on it. And so these are things that were also added to the collection over the years.
So joining us today is Judith Rosenbaum, the Executive Director and CEO of the Jewish Women's Archive, who has spent a lot of time thinking about Henrietta Szold, Emma Lazarus, and of course, all Jewish women heroes. So we're so glad to have you with us today.
I'm so glad to be here with you.
Yeah. So let's start with Henrietta Szold and Emma Lazarus. And I also want to start with, you did an exhibition in 2005 and did a program with Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2004. And if I remember correctly, she brought up these heroes in that speech as well in 2004.
The program in 2004 that we did was part of our programming around the celebration of the 350th anniversary of Jewish life in America. And she was one of our keynote speakers as we were kind of telling the story of Jewish women's heritage and influence. And it was really exciting to hear her talk about herself as part of this lineage of Jewish women and thinking about her place, what she inherited from Jewish women who came before us, who her heroes were, and what she learned from them.
And what did she specify in that speech?
Well, first of all, she talked about her mother as one of them also. So it was interesting to hear her balancing both the kind of personal influence and the historical influences. But then she talked about Emma Lazarus as an influence on her. And she talked about Henrietta Szold. And, you know, one of the things I always think is interesting about Szold is, as you mentioned, her father was a rabbi. She was the oldest of many daughters. And in some ways, because her father only had daughters, he raised his daughters probably similarly to the ways he would have raised his sons had he had them. And so she had a certain kind of access to education and to, opportunities that she might not have had if she'd had brothers or had a different kind of father. And so in some ways, she had access to some of the authority of Jewish life through her father and through the kind of home that they created, where that particular Jewish domestic space gave her opportunities to participate and to learn and to feel that sense of personal authority that she might not have had otherwise.
And I think she says somewhere, maybe it's in one of the letters, but she said that her father never voiced regret for not having a son. That wasn't, it wasn't like, oh, I'm making do with these daughters. This was the kind of learning educational experience that I think is so important.
In particular, when she was talking about Henrietta Szold, she didn't only talk about kind of what we most famously know Szold for, which was the founding of Hadassah and her, creating an enormous women's movement and then creating so much of the infrastructure of what became the state of Israel. But she also talked about how she functioned as a person and some of her interpersonal skills. And she talked in particular about this letter that Henrietta Szold wrote in 1916 when her mother had died and a male family friend, offered to say Kaddish on her behalf. And she very graciously turned him down and explained why she felt that even though it was not the traditional practice at all, and really not something that was done at the time, that she was going to say Kaddish for her mother and why she thought that her mother would approve of that. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg talked about just the way that Szold wrote the letter and how gracious it was, but also how persuasive it was, and that she really held that up as kind of a model of how one might conduct oneself as a, principled and persuasive person.
And if I remember correctly, too, when Henrietta Szold was refusing this very kind offer of saying Kaddish, she said that her mother had thought it was okay when her own father had passed away, a rabbi, for the sisters to say Kaddish. That, in other words, the Henrietta Szold's mother, who's born, somewhere around 1830 or so, had this, or maybe 1840, had, I guess what we would call now this feminist streak. So it's important to realize that the kind of feminist movement and feminism among Jews doesn't begin in the 1960s or the fight for suffrage, but rather existed in really important ways. And these personal letters bear that out.
Right, and was passed down in terms of family traditions. So she sort of is making the case that this may not be accepted kind of Jewish legal practice, but in our family, it is the tradition. And, and we know from RBG's own life, her mother died right before she graduated from high school. And she was not allowed to say Kaddish for her mother. And that was a turning point for her in her own, kind of Jewish practice. She obviously remained a very committed and identified Jew, but in terms of her own kind of Jewish observance, that was a a breaking point for her, as it has been for so many women over the years. And often when I actually teach Szold's letter a lot because I really love it as a source also. And it's great to have that little extra add-on of then being able to talk about the impact it had on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But there are so many women who've had that experience of alienation and feeling very disconnected from community at a time when they very much needed the support of their Jewish community at times of loss, who have really found that experience of not being able to say Kaddish or fighting to say Kaddish to be turning points for them. And for women to hear that this has been a fight that generations of women have experienced, or an issue that generations of women have experienced, also kind of gives that longer arc, that this isn't just like a newfangled demand or a newfangled problem. This is something that really has a long history and many generations of people have experienced it. So given that Ginsburg herself had that experience, she doesn't talk about that in the speech that she related to the particular issue that Szold was discussing. She talks more about the way that Szold frames, her response, but one imagines that it spoke to her and resonated with her on a personal level as well.
Thinking to who Ruth Bader Ginsburg stated as her Jewish heroines, Emma Lazarus and Henrietta Szold, there were a lot of opportunities that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had that Emma Lazarus or Henrietta Szold didn't necessarily. And I think about one of the things about both Emma, there's a lot of similarities, I think, between Emma Lazarus and Henrietta Szold, right? That they're both Zionists before the term Zionism even comes about or is used in that way. They both care deeply about Jewish history and literacy. So while Szold comes from a family where the father is a rabbi and they're very connected to the synagogue, Emma Lazarus isn't in that way, because although they have a strong family connection to Sharit Israel, that wasn't a part of Emma Lazarus's childhood or daily or even weekly or even monthly life. However, Emma Lazarus expressed her Jewish identity through reading history, and Henrietta Szold did as well. And Henrietta Szold spent years as head of the Jewish Publication Society, and even was an early member of the American Jewish Historical Society, and was really involved in starting like these reading circles that a lot of women's organizations adopted, whether it was the National Council for Jewish Women or later Hadassah. And I think even Ray Frank in the 19-teens would be leading these among Hillels, but these ideas of women leading like these study sessions and reading about, again, not reading about prayer as much as they're reading about Jewish history.
Both Lazarus and Szold, share this ability to bridge that kind of intellectually rich tradition and believing that it's really important to immerse yourself in that, and also a kind of practical, how do you make change on the ground for people who are suffering kind of outlook, right? So Lazarus does both, right? She's a writer, she's interested in ideas and in kind of theories and in study. And then she also is an activist for, Eastern European immigrants and looking at their conditions and recognizing their conditions are dire and there's real help that they need, and how can, better off Jews address that in real ways. And Szold is similar. Like, she creates Hadassah originally sort of as a study group, but then goes on to really build the infrastructure of the entire medical system and social services system in Palestine and then the state of Israel. So she was also had a very kind of tachlis approach of like, okay, how do you actually make things better for people on the ground, even as we understand that we need a kind of rich sense of identity in order to make that possible. So, and I think that combination is pretty rare. And I think we see that in RBG too, actually. Like, RBG is clearly like an intellectual powerhouse and is really thinking very creatively about legal theory and sort of how you could apply things in interesting ways. But she also is really thinking about like, what are the actual things that hold women back? And
structurally,
right. What are the structures that we need to change in order to bring about true gender equality?
Right. Yeah. And to that point about practicality, Emma Lazarus helped found the Hebrew Technical Institute to teach people a trade. She was teaching English at night, and Henrietta Szold did the same thing. So again, these were people who were middle class or upper class, but devoted their days to helping newly arrived immigrants, whether they're coming in through Baltimore or they're coming in New York. Like, this was their world. And that important to realize that a lot of middle class, upper middle class Jewish women in the late 19th, early 20th century, like, lived out their Jewish identity as in helping immigrants.
Right. And maybe even helped us, I mean, not in the case of Szold, but in the case of Lazarus, built their Jewish identity in part around that, you know, or an aspect of her Jewish identity. I think in some ways the family she came from was a little bit scandalized by how much she identified with those immigrants. And clearly she developed a lot of her notions also of Zionism by watching their experiences and thinking about, you know, what it meant to be a Jew in the world and how Jews were being accepted in America at the time.
Absolutely. These women were really creative in coming up with kinds of identities that grappled with some of the core tensions.
Also, getting back to their personal experiences in terms of thinking about, you know, understanding structures, we talked about how family was an opportunity to create maybe a somewhat unconventional sense of Jewish practice and authority and all of that. And Lazarus too, her father was a big encourager of her as a writer. But then as they go out into the world, they encounter all these ways in which they are limited by gender, even though they have the skills and they've been incredibly successful. And, you know, it's hard looking at their stories and seeing the ways in which they excel and they work so hard and then doors are closed to them because of who they are as women, and in some cases, in Lazarus's case, as a Jew. And we see that in RBG's case also, right? You know, that she was incredibly smart, incredibly successful, and yet there were still doors that were closed to her as a Jew and as a woman in places where she ran into, you know, the limitations of the structural inequalities that were alive and well. And then she devoted her life to changing those things. And, you know, and Lazarus and Szold in their own ways also fought against that and sort of found creative ways to work around that. And then when they needed to, also really tried to build systems that were a different model.
Right. And Lazarus sadly passed away so young. She was only 38. So it's hard to know exactly what she would do or how she would be reacting to what would happen in the coming years, which were so important. But there's something, especially with Jewish identity, where it just strikes me, particularly with Szold, where doors were closed to her because she was a woman. Like here she was, one of the most learned women, and she goes to the Jewish Theological Seminary, and she's basically helping all of these newly arrived professors who have come from Eastern Europe. Like she's teaching them English, and she's really helping, you know, it's unclear how much she's actually writing their dissertations or putting their books together, because under her at the Jewish Publication Society, there were scores and scores of works that came out with her imprint and her knowledge of languages and her knowledge, of course, of the English language and her ability to write. Like, you know, to be at that seminary and know like she could never become a rabbi or she could never become a professor in the same way that these people who she was like literally like holding up. I don't know how you get past that resentment. And I know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg advocates for a sense of humor. I mean, Henrietta Szold would have had to be like a stand-up comedian in order to have the kind of humor to deal with all of that. But it seems like often she viewed it as opportunity.
Yeah, that is astounding. I think about that all the time, that she was there and working with all these people and doing a lot of their work probably for them, and that it was very explicitly stated she could study there, but as long as she understood she could never be considered for rabbinic ordination.
You know, one thing that's very different though about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's lives and life and those of Emma and Henrietta is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a wonderful marriage that was not only not a detriment or an obstacle to her career, but, you know, Marty Ginsburg, by all accounts, and certainly by hers, was someone who really just propped her up and supported her through her life. And you know, neither Emma nor Henrietta had that kind of partnership. Although I think you could argue that in a certain way, the relationships they had with sisters and other family members, you know, help in certain ways. But certainly, you know, this marriage that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Martin Ginsburg had it seems also unique even for the 21st century, let alone the 20th century.
Yeah, it does remind us that was a shift that for so often for women of Lazarus or Zold's generations, you could choose to have a career or a family, and you couldn't necessarily have both. And I mean, and even Ginsburg, sort of made her comments about you can't have everything at the same time, but you can, do different things in different phases of your life. And I think that actually is mostly true now as well. And, and as you said, right, even in the 21st century, most people don't have the kind of partnership that the Ginsburgs had.
I spent some time rereading Henrietta Zold's letters, and these were letters that we have in our archive addressed to her sisters, to various sisters. They're mostly 1920s and 1930s. So she's in Jerusalem most of the time, although there's a period of time that she comes back to the States. And she's, it's clear, if you just read these letters and you didn't know all of her accomplishments, you would feel like, oh, this is kind of a woman with lots of doubts, and you wouldn't necessarily know. And I just think that, I don't know why reading it, there were just so many doubts expressed about kind of like she's older, should she be in Palestine? Should she go back to America? She wasn't fully on board with some of the politics in Palestine, and it was, she had a difficult life, but yet she's accomplishing so much.
Yeah, well, I think so many, I was going to say women, but probably people too, other people
Yes.
Have an internal monologue that doesn't match their public persona. And I think also it's easier for us now to, I think she died at a moment that was a very uncertain time in history, right? She dies like right at the end
1945, yeah.
Right, of World War II. And Palestine is going through a lot of changes, and it's not, she didn't have the benefit of seeing that the state was going to be founded and seeing, sort of where things were necessarily going. And so I'm sure in the midst of that, it felt very precarious in some ways. So I loved seeing the pieces from the collection, the Hadassah Collection, that the archivists pulled out, and especially seeing that nurse's uniform and hat. And I mean, I love that kind of material culture. It's always, I love the paper and text and documents too, of course. And that's really where most of my work as a historian has been. But I love seeing the objects. And what that really reminded me of was just, that Szold is a figure and a leader, but there were so many women who she stands for and she represented, and whose careers and lives she enabled. All of these nurses, all of these social workers, all these people in Palestine whose the potential for their careers and their work she made possible. And so I kind of think of her and imagine this kind of like army of women behind her, all these nurses. And there's so many pictures also that I'm sure in your collection, of these like, vast sort of pictures of this nursing class and that nursing class, and all in their white. And it's very powerful to think that she played such a role in making that possible. And I think of RBG sort of in those same terms, this tiny woman in her very distinctive look with her robes and her collars. But then, I think part of why she became such a powerful icon is because there was such a juxtaposition between her tininess and her fierceness, and then the fact that she represented the lives and the capabilities of just millions of women whose lives her work changed. And so there, she kind of comes to stand in for this incredible power of the multitude. And it's hard for me not to look at either of them and see that multitude behind them.
No, absolutely. Like they allowed, this whole episode is on heroes. And so it's about RBG's heroes, Henrietta Szold and Emma Lazarus. But what's amazing to think about is the way in which Henrietta Szold and through Hadassah and through others created the platform for other people to become heroes. Like you don't have to just find other heroes, you yourself can become a hero. And that's what RBG, of course, did too with all of these laws. One of the things that struck me, I was watching, I think I love the, on Friday nights, Shields and Brooks conversations on PBS where they dissect the news and they talk about the news. And one of the things that David Brooks said about Ruth Bader Ginsburg was, basically she comes from Flatbush. Flatbush was an immigrant neighborhood. children of immigrants, Flatbush in Brooklyn, of course, and that it was a place where people rooted for the underdog. And he didn't specify what that meant, but that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is growing up in this environment where education is valued, and also this idea of fighting for the underdog. And I'm wondering what you think about that characterization, not just of Flatbush, but of kind of thinking about what was formative in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life. Of course, there are many people that grew up in Flatbush who did not become Supreme Court justices or spend their lives fighting for the underdog, but I'm curious what your thoughts were on that characterization and that the role that played in her childhood.
Yeah, what's interesting to me about it is it seems like in the way that she talks about it, she really identifies that as a Jewish value in some ways. And again, not to say that Jews are the only people who root for the underdog or that all Jews root for the underdog, but she does seem to identify that as a kind of Jewish impulse. Even in the piece that's in AJHS's collection, the speech that she gives about all of the Jewish justices that preceded her, she kind of identifies that there was a kind of lineage of caring about the poor and oppressed as part of Jewish heritage, and that drive for justice she saw very much for herself, but she also identified in these other justices as part of what it meant to be a Jew, even a Jew who had risen above those kinds of circumstances, or maybe even didn't come from those circumstances, but then has power to affect the circumstances of others. So, she recognized her own opportunities, and she talks both in that speech and in a speech that she gave for the Jewish Women's Archive. She was very careful to say that she recognized that she had a lot of mazel. She said she had a lot of luck in the moment she was born and the kinds of opportunities she was able to pursue, and recognizing that wasn't true for people who came before her necessarily, but that it's important to recognize. And she also clearly has a lot of pride in, she sees those opportunities as part of the gift of America. She clearly has a lot of pride in America and the fact that it provided those opportunities that, as she said, enabled her in one generation to go from her mother being a bookkeeper in Brooklyn to her being a Supreme Court justice.
To go back to Flatbush too, though, right? So Flatbush is this neighborhood where everyone is rooting for the underdog, right? In this David Brooks conception. And of course but I don't think that they thought at the time that underdog meant women. Right? I mean, I think there was this way in which 1930s, 1940s, certainly 1950s, ideas of Jewish middle class life was that it was good for women to not have to go into the workforce, so that while you have this, daughters going into the workforce, daughters of the shtetl working in the 1900s, 1910s, and then the idea is you get married and then you go in, and then the Depression upsets that a little bit and women have more opportunities. But really there's this kind of idea that aspiration, if American Jews had an aspiration towards social justice, there also was a very strong aspiration for middle class status and advancement that often worked to the detriment of certainly women's careers. In the 19th century and much of the 20th century, women had to make a choice about career or family, and you really weren't able to merge them. And RBG is a kind of a wonderful example of how things could be different. But when I think of the four most famous women in our archive, whose papers are in our archive, it would be Emma Lazarus, and it would be Henrietta Szold, it would be Molly Pekin, and it would be Ray Frank. None of these women had children, yet their work was for the Jewish people and continuity in the most amazing way. I mean, I think one of Henrietta Szold's most wonderful acts was the creation of Youth Aliyah and bringing thousands of children from Europe to what would become the state of Israel and saving them and creating schools that have outlasted, that are still around today. I spent a year at Ramat Hadassah in Kiryat Tivon working with Ethiopian children that had come in. But so
and they said Kaddish for her, which I think also
right. That was what, and I think we have in our archive this beautiful the boy who said Kaddish for her. He becomes Avigdor Aricha, a wonderful artist. He was the boy who says Kaddish for her when she passes away. And the story that we have is that it was his drawings of the concentration camps that made her realize the gravity of everything. I mean, of course she knew the gravity already in the 30s, and that's why she's working. But I think there's a difference between knowing something and feeling something. And from the story that it was these paintings and drawings that this artist who would grow up to become a famous artist showed her that had that connection. So that piece as Kaddish for her is a beautiful thing because it's representing all of the children that she not only saved, but all the children that she's given an education and a future for.
I mean, I think it also connects to this idea of heroes, because why are heroes important? Because they make it possible for us to believe something's possible or to see things in a different way. And that's so much the work that we try to do at the Jewish Women's Archive, is really expand the range of role models that people have access to, because we often say, if you can see it, you can be it. Like you need to have stories to latch onto that inspire you or teach you something, or, can kind of fire you in a certain way. And it's a lot of it is about how you tell the story and how you make that accessible to people so that they can find the hero that speaks to their heart and that motivates them to move in a certain direction.
No, and your archive is amazing, the Jewish Women's Archive. And really, I'm not exaggerating when I say that I don't think a day goes by where I don't look something up at the Jewish Women's Archive. And I think one of the things that's so brilliant about it is that it's done in a way that it can serve as a resource for scholars, but very much it's accessible to anyone who cares about stories, because all of the entries are written in an engaging way, and that you're giving the world, you're giving the Jewish community, you're giving women, you're giving all of these people like hundreds and thousands of heroes. So Judith Rosenbaum, you are one of my heroes. Thank you so much for
there's so much synergy in the work that we do, so it's so fun to work together.
Which is great. So let's hope we have many more of these. And thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today about RBG and her heroes.
Thank you. Well, these women are my heroes too, so it's wonderful to get to engage in conversation with you about them.
Excellent.
Hi.
Hello.
So thank you all for tuning in. We're excited to kind of have this opportunity to chat live with you today. We did something new. We employed some polls, which were really fun to see as we were doing this. And I think one of the things that struck me in particular was the one about rooting for the underdog, in which 94% of you said that is an important part of American Jewish life and history.
Yeah.
That was really, really kind of amazing. I think one of the things that's hard about the polls is that we can only ask like multiple choice questions, so we're not able to get qualitative answers to that or find out more. I mean, I think if we could, we would ask, what generation are you and did you grow up? Same with that question about how many of you learned about Jewish women, these Jewish women in particular, Emma Lazarus and Henrietta Szold growing up, and about 44% said not at all. So that struck me. I mean, and I'm curious kind of also when you grew up, because it would be interesting to see whether people who've been growing up since the Jewish Women's Archive has come about have had more of experience in learning about that. And someone asked if Jewish day schools teach about these women, and I mean that's a great question. I think one thing I have found, unfortunately, with some Jewish day schools, maybe not all, is that because they have to teach so much Jewish study stuff, that when they teach history, they tend to do like secular history and American history and not so much American Jewish history. So sometimes that gets lost, although I think there are probably wonderful exceptions to that rule.
Probably, yes.
Yeah. And the Covenant Foundation does a really good job of trying to encourage Jewish educators to teach about history and to teach about all of this. But yeah, someone asked a question, Melanie, too, about whether our archive has materials on Golda Meir, who was the prime minister of Israel in the 1970s.
The answer is sort of yes and no. So we do, because obviously she was such an important individual and she had so many contacts with important Jewish Americans. So a lot of the stuff that we have on, say, like Golda Meir is contained within other archival collections. personal collections of people who went to Israel, people who did fundraising for Israel, that kind of thing. So we do, and we also have a great many books, as you can imagine, biographies of her that were written about her. So so we do, but I think probably much of the objects and documents that really are the primary sources about her are probably in Israel, probably at the National Library or National Archive of Israel would be my guess. And somebody also asked about Bella Abzug. I wish we had the Bella Abzug archive. I would be delighted to. Much of it is at Columbia, actually. Looks like she donated a bunch of her personal materials there. So sadly, it is not here. I wish it was.
And going back to Golda Meir, the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee, I think, has some stuff in their collection, because Golda Meir, though born in near Kiev, grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I think there's some material at the Jewish Museum there, I believe. Someone asks a really good question. Is there an index for the archives, and how can an individual access any of these archives? That's an excellent question. And if we have one goal of these programs, is that you will all feel empowered to be searching our own archives. So I'm going to let Melanie take that question, because she can guide you through that. And we can also be doing individual tutorials for you and follow up, but Melanie will give you a general sense of that.
Absolutely. So for individual archival collections, there's basically what's called a finding aid, which functions like a table of contents. So that lists everything that's in every box, what the folders are, what the time span of the collection is. And there's one of those for each of the archival collections that's here. So then how do you find these? How do you actually find these items, right? So I'm going to actually type it in the chat box here. So all of our books and archival materials are accessible through search.cjh.org, which is the portal that has all of our different collections in it. So for example, if you just search for Hadassah, what will come up is not just the Hadassah collection, but also the Hadassah magazine, books written about Hadassah, all of that. But when you click on the finding aid, then you can see, oh, Annie's sharing her screen, so we can see, there we go, Hadassah Archives on long-term deposit. So you click into that, and then that tells you generally what's in the collection, sort of a short, at least a short description. But when you click on, say, like related online content or finding aid or link here, there's a couple different ways it's phrased. Then that brings you into the, that should be it. And then the Hadassah Archives. And so, and the Hadassah Archive, like I said, is very big. It is the third largest one here. It is an absolutely fantastic collection. It is so rich and has like just so much content. But like, so yeah, if you, sadly, there's not a whole lot of digitized content just yet, but we're working on that. We hope to rectify that.
And we'll be sending all of you who registered with us a list of the collections that are digitized that we mentioned. So we'll send you the link to the speech that RBG gave about the Jewish justices. We'll send you a link to Emma Lazarus's digitized material, specifically the book where she wrote The New Colossus and her other works. And we'll also send you the links to the finding aids too. So that's something where you can start exploring and give you a little bit of a boost in that exploration. I also want to note that our Toback wrote in that I don't know if it's a he or she or they went to school in East Flatbush, less well off than Flatbush, in the late 1950s and early 60s. We learned about every immigrant and minority who did just about anything important, from Brandeis to Sojourner Truth. It was U.S. history, reading, and science. I hope that every high school in this country, and not just in Flatbush, and not just in the late 1950s and 60s, has that kind of education, because clearly when we know our history, when we know the complexities of that history, when we know the varieties of that history, that's what can unite us as a country. And I think we all can agree that this country needs uniting, and the extent to which good history teachers and history classes can do that, that's wonderful. Lucille Saphir is asking, do you have a book that highlights these and other influential Jewish women? So one thing, again, that's really important is Judith's website, the Jewish Women's Archive,
yes.
JWA, jwa.org, I believe. That's basically a kind of encyclopedia that's online that you can look up all sorts of women, and it's really endless. You'll keep linking to other people. So I really advise you and encourage you to do that. There's also an encyclopedia that was written, co-edited by Deborah Dash Moore, who's a historian who's on our board, and also the late historian scholar Paula Hyman, who did so much to create the field of women's history and gender history and in modern Jewish history, who actually is Judith's mother, was Judith's mother. They wrote the Encyclopedia of Jewish Women that I think is a great 2-volume book that is really, really fun to page through. But basically, the Jewish Women's Archive is an extension of that work. And then there's a lot of great books in women's history in general. I know that specifically Moment magazine, the editor there, Nadine, I'm blanking on her name, but it will come to me. She's writing a book now on RBG's Jewish Women Hero. So look for that from Moment magazine, Nadine Epstein. And another book that comes to mind on Jewish women, I mean, there are many, but Hazia Diner has an overview. Pamela Nadell just came out with and it's in paperback now, a book on US women in history. This is not as well known, but a book called Daughters of the Shtetl by Susan Glenn that I had referenced is a great book about the immigrant women working when they first came to America. So there's a variety of really wonderful books. Another book by Melissa Clapper called Banners, Babies, and Ballots, and it's about Jewish women and suffrage, and really fascinating as well. So there's also, I know that Francine Klagsbrun, who wrote a biography of Golda Meir and many other books and was involved in Ms. Magazine, I think, she's writing a book now on Henrietta Szold. So I think that'll be a great book when it comes out too.
Also, before, one thing I also want to mention, so as you can imagine, having the Hadassah archive here is absolutely wonderful. And I did a talk recently for Hadassah National, and they wanted me to mention, because there might be some Hadassah ladies on here. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
For Hadassah National, which is going to be in February, but we're going to discuss the history of Hadassah cookbooks and the recipes that were in the magazines and sort of that history of Hadassah cooking and that aspect of women's history, which is also really interesting, and there's a lot to learn from that. So the information should be on the Hadassah website. I forget what I'm talking, but it's February.
Yeah, and Melanie does as you saw, Melanie does a great presentation using the archives from Hadassah. So for the Hadassah women out there, if you want to book her, she's a great explicator and exhibitor of the wonderful archives here.
Archive, like the archive makes it easy to give the talk. Like every box I open up, I find something that is just new and interesting. I mean, when Chelsea, when we were in the archive doing that, like just pull one box off and you'll find something that's amazing in there. So
yeah, and I also want to shout out Susan Woodland, who was the archivist at Hadassah for many years and then was here with that collection, who did so much to organize it and examine it. Let's see if there's, I'm just looking at the question. Okay, so it looks like we got some of the questions done. So thank you all. I also want a huge shout out to Chelsea Bracci, who makes these episodes happen, who weaves in the photos, who weaves in the archives, who films us, who edits this, and just does so much work. So a big shout out to Chelsea Bracci, and shout out to all of you. Now the next ones that are coming up, we're gonna have a really fun one on Thanksgiving, including a food recipe for how to make a historic, I think, pumpkin pie recipe that should be really, really fun. That'll be right before Thanksgiving. We're going to do an episode on anti-Semitism after Thanksgiving, looking at it in the beginning in the 19th century and looking at some of the fascinating cartoons and archives that we have here. And we'll be joined by historians Lila Berman and Tony Michaels. And then in mid-December, we're going to do one on the American Jewish Congress and looking specifically at civil rights. So that's what we have lined up. We hope you can join us for next ones, and feel free to also contribute to the American Jewish Historical Society. And thank you to all of those of you who are on who already do, and also contribute to the Jewish Women's Archive as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.